Most people imagine unity as the disappearance of individuality. They assume that if consciousness ever becomes truly connected, then personality, perspective, and uniqueness must eventually dissolve into sameness. That assumption appears reasonable at first because many systems teach oneness through reduction rather than coordination. Yet you may notice something important when you begin studying the movement of living systems closely enough. The strongest systems in existence are not built through sameness at all. They are built through differentiated coherence. A human body does not function because every cell becomes identical. The body functions because different forms remain distinct while participating in one greater movement. Your lungs do not become your heart in order to achieve unity with it. Your nervous system does not erase the existence of your bones in order to create harmony. The intelligence of the body emerges because millions of differentiated structures move in coordinated relationship without losing their essential nature. Once this becomes visible, many spiritual ideas begin rearranging themselves naturally. This is why solar monad consciousness is often misunderstood when viewed only through the language of merging. The field is not attempting to erase the individual. It is attempting to harmonize the individual into a larger continuity of awareness. That difference matters because erasure creates fear, while harmonization creates participation. Many people resist deeper connection because they secretly believe connection threatens identity. Yet healthy connection has never required disappearance. It requires resonance. You can observe this pattern in ordinary life long before metaphysical language becomes necessary. A healthy conversation does not force two people into identical thought. A healthy relationship does not destroy distinction between individuals. Even music itself only becomes meaningful through coordinated variation. If every instrument played the same exact note continuously, the song would collapse into monotony rather than unity. Harmony requires difference that is learned how to move together. This begins revealing why fragmentation creates so much exhaustion inside modern consciousness. Most people are not tired simply because they work too much or think too much. They are tired because large portions of their inner structure are moving against each other continuously. One layer desires expansion while another fears visibility. One layer seeks truth while another protects familiar identity. One layer moves toward coherence, while another remains loyal to inherited fragmentation. The nervous system experiences this contradiction as pressure because contradiction requires constant energetic maintenance. Raic consciousness approaches this problem differently than many hierarchical systems do. Instead of attempting to dominate lower aspects into obedience, it increases internal coherence until contradiction loses structural stability naturally. That process resembles light entering a room more than a ruler issuing commands. When enough clarity enters a system, certain distortions simply become difficult to continue maintaining. The individual begins feeling the strain of fragmentation directly rather than conceptual. What once felt normal starts feeling energetically expensive. This is why many awakenings begin quietly instead of dramatically. A person suddenly notices how much energy is required to pretend. They notice how exhausting performance has become. They notice how much of their life has been organized around managing contradiction rather than expressing truth. At first, these realizations may appear emotional or psychological, but deeper observation reveals something structural underneath them. Consciousness itself is attempting to reorganize toward greater coherence. You may also notice that increased coherence changes perception before it changes circumstance. The external world may initially remain the same, while your relationship to it alters completely. Conversations become easier to read because hidden tension becomes visible. Environments begin feeling either nourishing or draining almost immediately. Certain forms of entertainment suddenly feel heavy instead of pleasurable. Some relationships deepen rapidly while others begin dissolving under the pressure of increased honesty. The external world starts reorganizing around the frequency of internal alignment. Many people mistake this phase for isolation because old forms of connection begin weakening before new forms fully arrive. Yet the weakening itself is often evidence of increasing coherence. False resonance can only survive while contradiction remains tolerated internally. Once the system begins stabilizing around greater integrity, many artificial connections lose energetic compatibility. This can feel painful at first because human beings naturally associate familiarity with safety. But familiarity and alignment are not always the same thing. A great deal of suffering persists because people continue attempting to preserve structures that were built from previous states of consciousness. They try to carry old identities into expanded awareness without allowing those identities to transform. They attempt to maintain social harmony by remaining partially divided against themselves. Over time, this creates an internal pressure that becomes difficult to explain to others because the conflict is no longer merely emotional. It becomes existential. The soul begins recognizing that fragmentation itself has become unsustainable. This is one reason solar symbolism appears repeatedly across civilizations. The sun does not negotiate its radiance according to external approval. It does not become smaller in order to avoid discomforting the darkness around it. Yet neither does it force itself aggressively upon existence. It radiates because radiance is its nature. The deeper implication here is often missed because people interpret solar consciousness as superiority rather than consistency. Real radiance is not domination, it is undivided expression. When consciousness becomes more coherent, action starts simplifying naturally, not because life becomes simplistic, but because fragmentation stops multiplying unnecessary movement. Many people spend years attempting to solve problems that are actually consequences of divided identity. They create complex strategies to manage conditions that only exist because different parts of themselves remain misaligned. Once coherence increases, a surprising amount of confusion disappears without needing intellectual resolution. The system stops generating friction against itself. This changes the meaning of intelligence itself. Intelligence is often treated as the accumulation of information, but information alone does not produce clarity. A fragmented person can possess enormous knowledge while remaining internally chaotic. Coherence determines whether knowledge can organize into wisdom at all. This is why some individuals speak very little yet create enormous stabilizing presence around them. Their consciousness is not scattering itself in multiple contradictory directions simultaneously. The energy that would normally be lost through fragmentation becomes available for perception. You begin seeing this pattern everywhere once the structure becomes visible enough. Entire societies can become fragmented in the same way individuals do. Institutions often continue functioning externally long after their internal coherence has collapsed. Cultures may speak constantly about connection while rewarding division psychologically, economically, and spiritually. People may claim to value truth while organizing their identities around emotional comfort instead. Over time, collective contradiction creates social exhaustion that no amount of stimulation can fully relieve. The Raic field approaches unity through another direction entirely. It does not begin by demanding ideological agreement. It begins by increasing resonance between living structures. In practical experience, this means consciousness gradually learns how to participate in larger wholes without surrendering authentic differentiation. The individual does not vanish into collective awareness. The individual becomes capable of carrying greater coherence while remaining fully distinct within the larger movement. like a star participating in a galaxy without ceasing to be a star. Once this becomes experiential rather than theoretical, many older spiritual fears begin dissolving naturally. The fear of losing oneself softens because deeper connection no longer appears synonymous with annihilation. The fear of individuality also begins softening because individuality is no longer confused with separation. You start realizing that isolation and uniqueness were never the same thing. One emerges from fragmentation, while the other emerges from authentic differentiation. They may look similar externally while producing entirely different inner realities. This also changes how a person understands responsibility. In fragmented consciousness, responsibility often feels heavy because every action appears isolated and self contained. In coherent consciousness, responsibility becomes relational. Every thought, emotion, and action participates in a larger field of influence, whether recognized consciously or not. This does not create paranoia or perfectionism, it creates awareness. The individual begins recognizing that coherence itself is contagious in the same way fragmentation is contagious. That realization slowly alters the way presence moves through ordinary life. A coherent person changes environments without needing to control them aggressively. Conversations reorganize around them differently. Emotional distortion becomes easier to detect because their nervous system is no longer normalized around contradiction. Even silence changes quality around someone who has stopped dividing themselves internally. Others may not understand why they feel calmer, clearer, or more exposed in that presence, but the effect remains noticeable regardless. Eventually, the question stops being whether unity exists at all. The deeper question becomes whether consciousness can participate in unity without collapsing into unconscious conformity. That is where the real teaching begins opening further, because the solar monad is not merely revealing that all things are connected. It is revealing that connection itself possesses architecture. Once that architecture becomes visible, the meaning of individuality, purpose, coherence, and even identity begins unfolding through an entirely different light. The reason unity frightens the individual is because most people have only experienced unity in distorted forms. They have seen families demand sameness in the name of love, institutions demand obedience in the name of belonging, and spiritual systems demand surrender in the name of enlightenment. So when the word unity appears, the nervous system does not always hear harmony. Sometimes it hears erasure. Sometimes it hears the old command to become smaller so a larger structure can remain comfortable. This is why the Raic field has to be approached with precision. Solar monad consciousness does not ask the individual to disappear into a collective identity. It asks the individual to become coherent enough to participate in a larger field without turning that participation into submission. There is a difference between unity that absorbs and unity that coordinates. Absorption weakens the individual by dissolving distinction. Coordination strengthens the whole by allowing distinction to serve a wider intelligence. You can see this clearly when you look at a light itself. A beam of light appears unified, but within it are many frequencies held in ordered relationship. The visible radiance is not produced by one flattened sameness, but by a spectrum moving as one expression. This matters because consciousness behaves in a similar way. The most radiant fields are not those that destroy difference, but those that allow difference to become transparent to a greater purpose. When individuality becomes transparent in this way, it does not vanish, it stops being defensive. Defensive individuality is the form most people confuse with selfhood. It has to prove itself, protect itself, announce itself, compare itself, and separate itself in order to feel real. Authentic individuality does not need that much noise. It has an inner tone that remains recognizable without needing constant opposition. When a being begins entering solar monad consciousness, the false forms of identity often become quieter because they are no longer required to hold the self together. What remains is not emptiness. What remains is a cleaner form of distinction. This is one of the first practical signs of Raic alignment. You stop needing separateness to prove that you exist. You can stand near other people's gifts without feeling diminished by them. You can participate in a larger vision without feeling swallowed by it. You can honor another person's path without interpreting it as a threat to your own. This does not happen because the ego has been destroyed. It happens because the ego has stopped being asked to perform the work of the soul. The ego becomes distorted when it is forced to create permanence inside a being that is still evolving. It builds narratives, preferences, defenses, and labels, then tries to make them feel eternal. Raic consciousness does not attack the ego, because attack would only strengthen the contraction. It brings enough solar clarity into the system that the ego can return to its proper function. It becomes a translator of experience rather than the ruler of identity. It helps the being move through form without pretending form is the whole self. When this shift begins, life may feel strangely less personal. That does not mean it becomes cold. It means events are no longer interpreted only through the wound of the separate self. A delay is not automatically rejection. Someone else's success is not automatically your failure. A season of solitude is not automatically abandonment. The same events may still occur, but their meaning changes because the interpreting center has changed. This is how consciousness becomes less reactive without becoming numb. The Raic field also changes how purpose is understood. In fragmented consciousness, purpose often feels like a private mission that must prove the individual's importance. The person wants to know what they are here to do because they secretly want assurance that their existence matters. There is nothing wrong with that longing, but the longing can distort the answer. Solar monad consciousness reveals that purposeness is not given to make the individual special. Purpose is the place where individuality becomes useful to the whole without losing its signature. This is why purpose cannot be separated from coherence. A fragmented person may chase purpose as an escape from themselves, but whatever they build will carry the same fragmentation forward. They may create from urgency, from comparison, from hunger, from the need to be seen, or from the fear of being ordinary. The work may still contain beauty, but its field will feel unstable. When purpose emerges through coherence, it feels different. It carries less force and more inevitability. You may notice this in your own life when something true does not require as much convincing. It may still require effort, discipline, and patience, but it does not require you to betray yourself in order to continue. There is a quiet alignment beneath the labor. Even obstacles begin to feel like part of the path rather than proof that the path is wrong. This does not mean everything becomes easy. It means effort stops being divided against itself. Solar monad consciousness also changes the way service is understood. Many people think service means giving more, sacrificing more, or becoming constantly available to others. But service without coherence often becomes leakage. It can look noble on the surface while quietly feeding resentment, exhaustion, or hidden superiority. The Raic stream teaches that true service is not measured by how much of yourself you lose, it is measured by how clearly your being transmits what it is aligned to carry. A lamp does not serve by destroying itself. It serves by allowing current to move through a stable structure. If the structure burns out, the light does not become more holy. It becomes unavailable. This is a simple truth, but many spiritual people resist it because they were taught that exhaustion proves devotion. Raic consciousness corrects this by restoring the relationship between radiance and sustainability. What cannot be sustained cannot become a stable offering. This reframes generosity. Generosity is not only the act of giving, it is the quality of giving from a field that remains intact. A person can give time, care, money, wisdom, or energy while secretly reinforcing their own fragmentation. They may give because they fear rejection, because they need to be needed, because they want moral superiority, or because they do not know how to receive. The action may appear generous, but the underlying field is not free. Solar monad consciousness brings attention to the field beneath the action. Once the field beneath action becomes visible, ethics deepen naturally. You stop asking only whether something looks good and begin asking what it transmits. You stop judging service by appearance and begin sensing whether it increases coherence or dependency. You stop confusing rescue with love and exhaustion with devotion. The Raic stream does not make compassion smaller. It makes compassion cleaner. Cleaner compassion helps without binding, gives without performing, and withdraws without hatred when withdrawal preserves truth. There is another layer here, because unity also changes how conflict is understood. In fragmented consciousness, conflict is usually interpreted as opposition between separate selves. One person must win, one must lose, one must be right, one must be wrong. But within a larger field of coherence, conflict can also reveal where a system has not yet learned how to harmonize difference. This does not mean all conflict is sacred or all harm should be tolerated. It means conflict becomes information before it becomes identity. This is a major shift in perception. When conflict becomes identity, people harden around their positions and stop listening for the deeper pattern. When conflict becomes information, the system can ask what is being revealed through the tension. Is there a boundary missing? Is there a truth unspoken? Is there a false agreement that can no longer hold? Is there a difference that needs structure rather than suppression? Solar monad consciousness does not erase conflict. It makes conflict more readable. A coherent being can participate in conflict without becoming possessed by it. They may still feel anger, grief, urgency, or pain, but those movements do not automatically take command of the whole field. Something wider remains present. The wider presence allows action to become more precise. The person can say no without hatred, speak truth without theatrical force, and leave without needing to turn the other into an enemy. This is not weakness. It is a sign that identity has become larger than reaction. As the Raic field continues opening, the meaning of oneness becomes more practical. Oneness is not an abstract spiritual statement that all things are somehow the same. It is the recognition that all things participate in fields of consequence. Nothing exists in total isolation. Not a thought, not a choice, not a wound, not a healing. Every internal movement teaches the surrounding field how to relate to you. And every external pattern shows something about the field it came from. This recognition does not create blame, it creates participation. Participation is the word that matters here. Solar monad consciousness does not turn you into a passive witness of cosmic unity. It makes you more responsible inside the web of life because you understand that your state is not private in the way you once imagined. Your coherence affects the rooms you enter. Your fragmentation affects the people who depend on you. Your clarity makes certain distortions harder to maintain around you. Your avoidance gives those distortions permission to continue. This is why inner work is never merely personal. The deeper implication is that unity is not something humanity discovers only at the end of evolution. Unity is already operating, but most people experience it unconsciously. They are already connected through influence, imitation, emotion, language, memory, and shared fields of attention. The question is not whether connection exists. The question is whether connection is conscious enough to become harmonious. Raic consciousness brings sunlight into the existing web so participation can become deliberate rather than accidental. This is where the law of one stream becomes clearer. It is not a slogan that cancels distinction. It is a recognition that the one expresses through many centers without requiring those centers to collapse into sameness. Each center becomes more useful as it becomes more coherent. The many do not betray the one by existing. They reveal the one through differentiated radiance. The universe does not appear to love repetition. It appears to love variation that can remember its source. When this understanding matures, individuality becomes sacred in a new way. Not because the individual is separate from the whole, but because the whole can only express certain qualities through particularized forms. There are tones, insights, gestures, creations, and acts of courage that can only enter reality through a specific configuration of being. This means your uniqueness is not an obstacle to unity. It is one of the ways unity becomes articulate. To erase uniqueness would be to reduce the vocabulary of source. At the same time, uniqueness must be purified of defensiveness. A distorted individual uses uniqueness to separate, compete, and protect identity from contact. A coherent individual allows uniqueness to become contribution. The difference is felt immediately. One form says, "See how different I am?" The other says, "This is what I can offer because I have become honest enough to carry it." Solar monad consciousness does not glorify the individual. It dignifies the individual by returning them to function within the whole. This is why the Raic stream feels both vast and intimate. It speaks of solar fields, collective awareness, and the architecture of unity, but it also reaches into the smallest moments of personal life. How you answer someone when you are tired matters. How you carry your gifts matters. How you handle another person's brightness matters. How you respond when your old identity is no longer enough matters. Unity is proven in these ordinary places because the ordinary is where consciousness becomes embodied. The teaching continues to widen from here because solar monad consciousness is not only about becoming coherent within yourself, it is about learning how coherent beings form coherent fields together. It is about what happens when individuality stops competing for centrality and begins participating in shared radiance. It is about the shift from identity as possession to identity as transmission. And once that shift begins, the question of who you are becomes inseparable from the question of what your presence makes possible around you. When the individual begins to understand that uniqueness is not a barrier to unity, the next question becomes more delicate. If each being carries a distinct radiance, then the work is not to become more important, but to become more transparent to what that radiance is actually for. This is where many people confuse spiritual identity with spiritual function. Identity asks, "Who am I in a way that makes me feel secure?" Function asks, "What can move through me clearly enough to serve the wider field?" The raw extreme gently shifts attention from identity as self definition into identity as living participation. This shift does not make the self less meaningful, it makes the self more accountable to coherence. A person can spend years trying to discover who they are while avoiding the question of how their presence affects life around them. They may gather names, symbols, memories, lineages, and spiritual descriptions, yet still leave confusion behind them wherever they go. Solar monad consciousness does not reject those layers, but it asks whether they produce greater radiance or greater self fascination. The distinction is simple when felt honestly. True identity clarifies the field, false identity demands attention from it. You may notice this in the difference between someone who carries presence and someone who performs significance. Performed significance requires constant reinforcement because it is built from outer reflection. It needs to be recognized, named, validated, and placed correctly in the eyes of others. Presence does not need the same pressure. Presence acts like sunlight on a room. It does not argue for itself, but everything becomes easier to see when it arrives. This is one of the clearest signs of Raic alignment. The being becomes less hungry to be seen and more capable of helping others see. That does not mean visibility disappears. In many cases, visibility increases, but the relationship to visibility changes. The person no longer seeks attention as proof of existence. They allow visibility to become part of function when visibility serves the field. This is a major transformation because much of human ambition is built on wounded visibility. People want to shine because they were once unseen, but when unhealed hunger takes the throne, radiance becomes performance. Raic consciousness purifies visibility by returning it to service. The sun does not shine because it is insecure. It shines because radiation is the natural consequence of its internal fire. This image matters because solar consciousness is not effortful in the way performance is effortful. A person in true alignment still works, still chooses, still disciplines the body and mind, but the center of effort changes. They are no longer forcing light outward to convince the world they are real. They are tending the inner fire so the light can move without distortion. This is why sustainability becomes sacred in the Raic field. When radiance is forced, burnout follows. When radiance is embodied, endurance becomes possible. Many people try to serve from sparks instead of from a stable flame. So they surge, collapse, disappear, and return with guilt. This pattern is not failure of devotion. It is failure of structure. The Raic stream teaches that light must have architecture if it is going to remain available. Without structure, even sincere radiance scatters. This is where discipline becomes reinterpreted. Discipline is not punishment applied to the self. It is the form that allows energy to remain coherent across time. A scattered person may have powerful inspiration, but inspiration alone rarely creates a stable offering. A coherent person learns how to create vessels for inspiration, rhythms for expression, and boundaries around their own life force. This makes their radiance less dramatic at times, but more trustworthy. The field begins to know they can carry what comes through them. The law of one stream becomes very practical here. If all things are connected, then instability is never merely personal. What you do with your energy affects every relationship, project, community, and field that depends on your participation. This does not mean you must become perfect. It means you must become honest about the consequences of your fragmentation. A person who repeatedly collapses may still be loved, but they cannot pretend their collapse has no field impact. Raic consciousness brings compassion without removing consequence. This is why collective unity cannot be built from individuals who refuse inner responsibility. A group may share beliefs, symbols, language, and devotion, yet still remain incoherent if each member carries unresolved contradiction into the field. Shared ideology is not unity. Shared emotional intensity is not unity. Shared opposition to an outside force is not unity. True unity requires that each participant becomes coherent enough to contribute without constantly making the collective manage their inner division. You can see this pattern in families, spiritual communities, creative groups, and social movements. A vision may be beautiful, but if the participants are fragmented, the vision becomes a stage for unresolved patterns. Competition hides under service. Control hides under leadership. Dependency hides under loyalty. Avoidance hides under peace. The Raic field does not shame these dynamics, but it illuminates them because no collective field can exceed the coherence of what its members repeatedly bring into it. This is where radiant individuation becomes essential. The individual must become clear not to separate from the whole, but to participate in the whole without contaminating it with unconscious need. This is a different understanding of spiritual maturity. Maturity is not becoming less individual. It is becoming less distorted in the way individuality expresses. The more coherent the individual becomes, the more safely they can enter collective structures without turning the collective into a substitute parent, a mirror, or a battlefield. This also changes the meaning of leadership. In fragmented systems, leadership often becomes dominance, charisma, or control of narrative. In Raic consciousness, leadership is the ability to stabilize radiance in a way that helps others access their own. A true solar presence does not create dependency on its light. It reminds other centers of their own capacity to burn clearly. This is why healthy leadership does not hoard attention. It distributes coherence. You may feel the difference immediately around people who lead from radiance rather than hunger. They do not need to make others small. They do not require confusion in order to appear wise. They do not keep people dependent through mystery, fear, or constant emotional intensity. Their presence simplifies without flattening. Their clarity strengthens the room rather than centering only themselves. This is not because they have no ego, but because the ego is no longer managing the whole field alone. The deeper implication is that solar monad consciousness is not only a teaching about unity, but a teaching about clean transmission. Every person transmits something. Some transmit anxiety while speaking peace. Some transmit competition while speaking service. Some transmit need while speaking love. Some transmit clarity even when they say very little. The raw extreme trains attention toward the transmission beneath the words, because the field beneath expression often tells the deeper truth. This is why speech becomes more important under solar awareness. Words are not merely descriptions, they are carriers of state. A person can speak correct ideas from an incoherent field and leave others subtly agitated. Another can speak simple ideas from a coherent field and leave others more whole. This does not mean content no longer matters. It means content and state must become aligned. The teaching is not only what is said, the teaching is what the speaker's field make possible while saying it. As consciousness becomes more solar, the desire to manipulate outcomes begins loosening. Manipulation is usually the strategy of a divided self trying to control external reality because it does not trust internal coherence. The more coherent a being becomes, the less they need to bend events through force. They can act clearly, speak directly, and allow consequence to reveal what is compatible. This creates a form of peace that is not passive. It is active without being desperate. It moves without grasping. This changes how one relates to manifestation. Many approaches to manifestation center on desire, image, and personal outcome. Raic consciousness asks a deeper question. Is the field coherent enough to hold what it asks for? Desire by itself is not always wisdom. Sometimes desire comes from wound, comparison, fear, or hunger for completion through external form. Solar alignment does not reject desire, but it illuminates its origin. Once the origin is seen, desire can be purified into direction. Purified desire feels different from craving. Craving pulls the body forward while leaving the field contracted. Purified desire opens direction without abandoning inner steadiness. It does not need to prove itself through urgency. It can wait, adjust, listen, and remain alive without becoming obsessive. This is another way the raw extreme teaches radiant individuation. The being learns to want without fragmenting. The will becomes solar instead of anxious. Eventually, the teaching returns to the individual, but not the individual who began the path. At first, the individual wants unity to answer loneliness. Then the individual wants purpose to answer significance. Then the individual wants radiance to answer visibility. But through the solar field, each longing becomes refined into function. Loneliness becomes participation. Significance becomes contribution. Visibility becomes transmission. Desire becomes direction. This is why the Raic field can feel ancient and immediate at the same time. It speaks to cosmic unity, but it also asks how you enter a room. It speaks to collective monad consciousness, but it also asks whether your daily rhythm supports your light or drains it. It speaks to the law of one, but it also asks whether your relationships make you more coherent or more divided. The scale is vast, but the application is intimate. Solar truth does not remain impressive at a distance. It becomes real only when it changes how life is lived. The final movement of this teaching is not closure, but orientation. Solar monad consciousness reveals that the one is not asking the many to disappear. The one is asking the many to become coherent enough that the difference can become music instead of conflict. Each being becomes a note, a center, a lamp, a living point of radiance with its own necessary function. The work is not to be absorbed into light, but to become clear enough that light can pass through without being bent by fear. And once this is understood, the path opens into a larger responsibility. You are not here to find yourself. You are here to refine the self until it becomes trustworthy as a vessel of what moves through it. You are not only here to belong to the whole, you are here to participate in the whole without abandoning the signature that only you can carry. This is where unity becomes more than a belief. It becomes a living discipline of radiance, and the next question begins to rise quietly inside the field. What kind of world becomes possible when enough beings stop competing to be the center and begin remembering how to shine together?
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.